Okay, so hello everybody. I'm John Diamond. I'm in Manchester in the northwest of England. And this is one of a series of conversations that Christa and I have been organising where we listen to colleagues involved in different aspects of public policy, either at a local level or national level, either as volunteers or professionals and practitioners. So perhaps we could just go round and introduce ourselves for the purposes of the webinar, if that's okay. Eve, do you want to say who you are?
Sure. So I'm Eve, and I'm sat here in my garden, my office in my garden in Manchester as well, in in the north of England. And yeah, as well as being, I guess, a resident of Manchester, I'm a councillor in Manchester as well. So I have a political position. And then I'm what's described as the strategic director of a charity called Greater Sport, where the task is really leading a movement for movement across Greater Manchester. And it is having, I think, all those dual roles that is the bit that I love, really, from very hyper local on my street through to kind of Greater Manchester and sometimes nationally as well.
Thanks. Donna, do you want to say who you are?
Yeah, thanks very much, John. So I'm Donna Hall, and my background is at local government chief exec. So that my last gig was at Wigan, did something called the Wigan Deal with citizens, where we tried to think differently about the role of public services, the purpose of public services in a place, and rather than having a transactional relationship with citizens, having a more relational approach to working with them differently. And I know Eve of old. We're friends, Eve, aren't we? I first met Eve when she started this brilliant campaign before she was a councillor called, so it was based on the devolution campaign for Greater Manchester, which had no women featured in the signing of the devolution agreement with NHS England. So it was all men. And so she started this fantastic campaign. So rather than it being called Devomank for devolution, she called it Divamank, and it was all about women. Women in Greater Manchester. It's fantastic. She's brilliant.
Thanks, Donna. Christa, do you want to say who you are and where you are?
So much, John, for inviting all of us, and I'm so intrigued by meeting you, Eve and Donna. I'm looking so much forward to our talk. And I'm from Copenhagen, sitting here in the middle of Copenhagen, working in the Action University. I have a background as a researcher in public management, but I also think that research needs to go out where the people are, be able to create relations and learn from within experimentations and create new kind of relations and partnerships to create new kind of local value. So this is what the kind of conversations and actions that I'm very curious about. And I think the people that I talk with here in Copenhagen, managers that I teach and engage with, are very interested in the things that you're doing, because I think you have some more kind of experience in this field, maybe in some of the managers in Denmark, because you have been forced to work this way, I think in UK, before we had here in Denmark. So I'm looking forward to listen to your experiences.
Okay, so that's probably a good place to start, about the idea of being forced to or wanting to. I think I'm struck by how over the last, I don't know how long you want to say, 30 years, 40 years, big changes in local government in the UK, big changes in the ideas about the idea of what local government is about, its role, its function. Much of that coming from the Conservative Party of the sort of the late 70s, early 80s. And I guess if we kind of fast forward to today, and the point you were making, Donna, about the relational dimension and the importance of relationships, and the point you were making, Eve, about the importance of campaigning, of not-for-profit organizations having a really important part in trying to shape things. I wonder whether you feel the changes that have happened over the last few years have helped you in promoting those ideas, or whether they've kind of made you adopt those particular ideas. While you're pondering on that, and thinking about that, one of the things that I think we're all aware of, aren't we, is how difficult sometimes it is to work across the boundaries of different organisations. And often citizens don't get involved in that, or excluded from that. The point you were making, Donna, about Eve's campaign over devolution in Manchester exemplifies that in many, many ways. So perhaps we could start with that idea of choice. I mean, do we think that what's happened in the last few years paradoxically has opened up a space, or are we doing this in spite of the restrictions and the limitations? Maybe we could start with you, Donna, because it was that notion of relationships and relationship building that I think strikes me as being really important.
Yeah, I think it's been despite the government, to be honest, John. I think austerity and the cuts that have been imposed on public services, the NHS and local government, but mainly local government over the last 12 years have had a horrific effect on councils. And it's reduced their capacity to do a lot of the thinking and the strategic planning, and lots of posts have been cut, as well as lots of frontline posts in social care, for example, where coupled with Brexit and the funding cuts, it's just been a disaster for public services. And I think some councils are teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, I'll be honest. And I think despite that, I think one thing that actually has helped, and it's a horrible thing to say it, but is the pandemic, in terms of raising awareness of the importance of communities and mutual aid and supporting people and your neighbours working together. And that's really, I think some of that work has accelerated the relational working. I think it's been despite, definitely. I think although people have all read Radical Help, they've all read the Wigan Deal evaluation by the King's Fund, they've all read the theory of it, they've all read the donut stuff that Kate has produced, and fantastic theories out there. But I think people are really struggling just to run basic services at the moment, I'll be honest. I don't know what Eve feels about that, but relational working, we all know that it's really important. We all know the expense, the cost of not working relationally. It's hugely expensive, and it's just terrible in terms of the outcomes it produces. It's ridiculous. So, I mean, I think there are some great examples. Some of the work that Eve's leading with Greater Sport is really, creating social movements in neighbourhoods and places it's fantastic to see that happening. But I think big organisations like NHS trusts and some councils are so far off relational working. They've just resorted back to the clipboard way of working, where it's all about managing, gatekeeping, eligibility criteria, rather than actually thinking differently about supporting people. So that's kind of my experience, John.
Did you want to add to that, Eve?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with everything that Donna said, and certainly in terms of the sort of, I'd say, pretty hostile conditions really in the UK to working in a relational way and to shifting power and where power sits and resources. But I think despite of that, I again agree with Donna that actually it's been in facing up to multiple crises, be that COVID, be that climate, be that now cost of living, that we also see, don't we, the superpowers of humans, despite the government, despite whatever financial kind of restrictions going on, because see that actually ultimately we really care for each other, and that we have this phenomenal capacity as human beings for love and for being creative and for generating things even in difficult circumstances. So I do agree that I guess it's been that, we say that the crack is where the light comes in. We have seen in that the light, and I think that I'd say it has accelerated in my experience, both as a councillor at a hyper-local level, in seeing, we talked about mutual aid groups, we've talked about seeing people on their streets, really that flow of of stepping forward to support each other in these moments. And then also in my role in Greater Manchester, I have seen that some of those boundaries between organisations and sectors were quickly eroded because people recognised they had such a clear common purpose, that they did abandon their lanyards and their in egos, and maybe their kind of, my job is defined by what sits in my job description, to we've got this clear mission and we're all going to work towards that mission and to the shared outcome of ultimately protecting lives. And I think that has been incredibly powerful. But back to the reality as well, what Donna said, it feels very fragile. So I think at the moment what we're seeing and experiencing is both this outpouring of recognition of working differently and the power of relational working and of building networks, and a focus on the job to be done collectively and shared outcomes, is a real kind of, it gives people hope, and it mobilizes, it motivates, and it does kind of generate energy. But at the same time, it does rely on a level of resource, and energy is low because people are exhausted in the last few years. And resources, I think, that have flowed from the public sector are now under even tighter levels of scrutiny. And I think there's a real risk at the moment that even those leaders in the public sector who believe in this kind of work and have seen the benefits of it, they're now having to account for every penny. And I think there's a real risk that all the good work around going further upstream and more preventative work, and in knowing that you have to create conditions within a system and things to change, that we go back actually to far more of your traditional KPIs, and on things that can demonstrate, for example, in the health sector, that you are alleviating the operational pressures of the here and now in a very short-term way. And that's the funding from the government from everywhere is a very short term, it's sticky plaster, it isn't doing the long term. So I think it does feel fragile, which is why we have to hold on to the things that are the constants in this world.
So sorry if I'm telling you something Christa, but KPIs are key performance indicators. So the measurements by which public agencies are judged as to whether they've met their outcomes.
English word we have in Denmark, actually. I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but yes. We actually have it full scale.
So it sounds like what you're both saying in different ways, and I wonder, this is where Christa might either ask a question or share her experience. Sounds like the conditions that gave rise or give rise to relational working practices are quite fragile in the UK at the moment. A combination, you were saying, Eve, of people just being tired, the impact of the pandemic, but maybe also the pandemic is extraordinary and there's an understanding why services might have responded in that particular way. But now we're going back to normal, but a new kind of normal, which is what you were saying, Donna, worse than ever before in terms of funding. And therefore the challenge for people managing those services is more demanding, perhaps now in 2022 than it was maybe even 10 years ago, just at the time when austerity was being introduced. So if I was to sum it up, it sounds like all the ingredients for making this harder are present, but there is something quite important about still articulating why a relational approach is important, because it has gains and positive benefits, both to the individuals involved, but also to the nature of the services. Would that be a fair way of summing up what you said before I bring Christa in? Yeah. Christa, is there a question that, or something from the context you're working in which echoes what Donna and Eve have been saying?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of parallels also to the Danish municipalities, but I think also a lot of top managers are talking about co-creation, sharing, and involving But when it comes to actually doing it, it can be very difficult, and you kind of lack methods, a way to reorganize the organization and to set people free to actually share and to create these kind of relations. So I think also you have all these buzzwords, but on the very practical level, I think people don't know really how to cope with it. Also, they are telling, oh, we don't have the time. We know it works, we don't have the time and the money and everything. So from my point of view, I'm also curious, and maybe to you, Donna, despite of how difficult it can be to work in this way because of the structural things and the crisis and everything, what are your experience about working like this? How do you actually do it?
I mean, just bear in mind as well that I started it before these multiple crises. I left before all these multiple crises started. Very fortunately for me, but not for So it was before, it was in the middle of austerity. Actually, at the start of austerity, we started the deal, and it wasn't just something that came fully fledged, overnight. It was a real iterative process where we started off by having to make 160 million savings, and we knew that we had to reinvent our role, recreate our role, repurpose ourselves. So rather than just think about our purpose as being to provide excellent services and to support the most vulnerable people in communities, which was our vision before, we wanted to really radically shake up our purpose. And we had some quite great politicians like Eve, who had vision and wanted to do things differently. Rather than just cut back on services, they wanted to really strategically step back and think about, what are the assets that we have in this place? And it's the people. So how do we work differently with the 323,000 people, a lot smaller than Manchester City Council, but still substantial, really? What do we do to really try and maximise the assets and work differently with the citizens? And we did some work with Hilary Cotton, actually, back in 2011. And she showed us, we took 25 families. It was called the Life Project. It's in Radical Help. You may have read about it, but we took 25 families and we asked her to map out why, despite the amount of money we were spending supporting the families, multi-agency support, why we weren't actually making a difference to their lives. In fact, in most cases, their lives were getting worse. And what we found was that we were spending between $250,000 and $500,000 a year across all the different agencies in supporting them. And at the end of the year, they were worse, usually. And it was, when we broke it down across a 10-year period, it was because we'd spent 80% of our time on assessment, continued assessment and referral to other bits of the system. And the assessment process was about eligibility criteria, meeting eligibility criteria. And if they couldn't meet it, if they weren't bad enough or poor enough or in enough debt or whatever, or drinking enough or in mental health meltdown, then we wouldn't be able to help them. So go away, try somewhere else. And that's where all the money was going. And every time we had a budget cut to find, each service had to make, say, 10% approach. They would raise the eligibility criteria. So we were saying, for example, if you take eating disorder services, we were saying to people, your body mass index is too high, so you need to go away, lose some more weight, and then when you've lost enough weight, you can come back and we can support you. And that was the kind of way of working that we had in place. And the way we used to judge ourselves, because Wigan's always been a good council, it's always had excellent services judged by the inspectors, but it was because if it was expensive, we thought it was good, rather than what the outcomes said, and rather than what people told us their experience of services was. So that was how we started. One example was working with women who'd had multiple children taken into care in hospital, in the delivery suite, and we did absolutely no work with those women at all. So they would have 2, 3, 4, sometimes more babies taken straight into care. And we would, because the key performance indicator was about fostering an adoption, not about supporting the women to have a job, more self-confidence, self-worth. We processed the child through the system, and we had great outcomes for adoptions and fostering, but we had multiple pregnancies, so more children coming into care every year. So we started to work with a charity called PAUSE, P-A-U-S-E, and they support the women. So rather than it being a municipal solution, a council can provide, we invested 13 million in fantastic community projects that could do some of the things that we just couldn't do. We couldn't get to, we couldn't build the trust with communities in quite the same way. So, and some of those outcomes that, they were amazing, that it all led to a 7-year increase in healthy life expectancy in the most deprived wards. And that was working on things like Eve works on physical activity, healthy eating, food cooperatives, credit unions, supporting people who'd been the victims of domestic violence, mental health support projects. Rugby is a big thing. It's a big sporting town in Wigan. So a rugby memories group for people with dementia, so it was non-stigmatized, non-eligibility criteria assessed services that were there on people's doorsteps, run by people who lived in the local community. And that was the kind of approach that we took.
It's super interesting. I also find that you're talking about how you strategically are financing or moving money from the system into the community. So it's not only, a partnership where you build up a relation, but you also honor it by actually investing in that community. I think that's super interesting. And also, I think from my knowledge from Danish municipalities that are working this way, is there some kind of anxiety among the professionals? Because I guess they also need to vision that they have a new purpose with how they work. So what is your experience about managing the professionals?
That's the hardest bit, Christa, absolutely the hardest bit. And the most disagreements, I can say now I've retired, the most disagreements were with social care colleagues, so in adults and children's, who some of them just refused, including senior managers, to work in a different relational way. They felt it would be dangerous. They didn't trust their clients. They didn't trust people to do the right thing, to make the right choices about their own lives. And so we had to change the leadership, being honest, Christa, so that we got people who did believe in trusting citizens to make the right choices and supported all the social infrastructure around them. And we're not frightened of inspectors. So we got Ofsted rated good for children's services at the time we were doing all of this stuff, but that was just down to a change in leadership. And I think similarly in social care, I used to get, when we would have these conversations, no, we can't change because people will die if you make us change. That was the argument back. And they didn't, I've mentioned the healthy life outcomes, but all of our outcomes got better. The other thing that we did, which is quite unusual, and Eve will be able to talk about this, is very often in councils, instead of stopping doing something that doesn't work, we keep it going and then we layer something else on top of it. So you've got this myriad of things and it's just so difficult to navigate for people. And I just think sometimes we've got to stop doing things that don't work. So day centres, for example, we had 50 day centres for people either working age with a learning disability or acquired brain injury, or people with dementia or needed additional support. And people were just put together who didn't know each other, didn't have any shared interests, in a really horrible old building that we couldn't afford to heat and staff, and and people thought that was good. So funding things in the local community that would keep people safe and well at home and socially connected, we felt was a much better way. So we shut them down because they didn't work. But it's doing that quite brave thing that I think it's hard for leaders to do that, isn't it, Eve? What do you think, Eve?
As ever, I always agree with Donna. I think there's a few things that felt particularly key there. One, I think always the trust. You have to have leaders, people that trust people, and it's just so fundamental. And how often we have people, yes, in politics, but in all parts of public life as well, who are constantly posing the question of, you need to trust me or us as an institution, but are not asking the question of, do they trust people? and what's getting in the way of that. And I'm constantly surprised by how low that level of trust is, I think, sometimes in people. And we need to do differently. We need to shift that dramatically. And sometimes, like Donna said, sometimes that means that, you know, sometimes you can grow it, and sometimes you just need to have different leaders in place who are ready to grow power and resources where people are, and to hand that over and not have that paternalistic view. So that trust is key. I think the word that you've used a few times, Christa, of freedom, is really important. And we need to give people freedom. I think, again, Donna did that when she was at Wigan, in really kind of knowing that you've got to have those core, recognising what the core ingredients that leaders needed, like trust and, you know, and a belief in the relational, but also then people having the freedom to do what they believe is right, and not being tied and micromanaged. And all of us then, I think, can do the job that is needed in the moment, and recognise that you're not constantly building in inefficiencies, to be honest, by constantly then passing on to somebody else when something needs to be done. So I know I think I have a real privilege in that in both my roles there is a level of freedom to, in one minute, be, you know, in a very strategic position, and another minute to go, well, what's needed here to turn these cogs is to actually just get my hands dirty and do a job, you know, and to be the person that writes those minutes up, or that takes that task, or that takes somebody for me to be. And I think that's the difference, is when we can all do the job that's needed in any moment, makes a massive difference. And to be honest, it's more rewarding as well, because you then touch all aspects of the work, as opposed to being locked in our own silos and then wondering why, as teams and organisations, we get locked in these sort of silos. And then I think back to your question around what felt like that kind of implementation gap. So this gap between where we talk good theory, talk a good talk, there's plenty of books, there's plenty of academics, there's plenty of people that can now talk the language of co-producing things and community power, but there's such a massive gap between that and the reality. And that gap means that we're not moving at the pace we need to make change. It also is dangerous because people fall in that gap, but also it erodes the trust. So we build, those of us who believe in it, build trust that we genuinely want this alternative way of being and existing, different relationship. But when people experience this and they hear all the talk and not the doing, that trust breaks down again, and you have to once again start all over again in trying to rebuild it. So we have to plug that gap quickly. And I think that's why, you know, in all the work that all three of you I know, and again, that's why Hilary Cottam, why Kate Rayworth, these people for me are really important, is they all are really good at bridging between what we've learned, what we've heard works, what doesn't work, and saying, let's stop it, to Donna's point, and then going, how do we create tools and ways and examples of what moves that to action? And not in a way that's overly prescriptive or precious or has ego, but with complete humility. So if you hear Hilary or Kate or Donna, you know, and from what I've already heard from you, Christa, there's always this wish to say, you know, we've seen this works, but pull it apart. You don't have to, we're not selling this to you as the model. This is one example of something that's worked. And then another consistency in all of this is to the strengths, and the consistencies is you go to people, you go to participation, you talk about place, and then you think about power in a different model of not a power that's a pie and that is finite and that we just have to kind of carve up and shift around, but as something that we can continue to grow, like love, like dough. You know, you create the conditions and that will be better for all of us. And I think when you pay attention to those things, we can really make significant change.
I find,
Go
oh, John, yeah, it's super inspiring, and it echoes a lot with what I'm doing and been doing for many years also. So, but and I think there might be a shift also from being very curious about representations and reflections around the table to begin to do something, to go to this action mode and create together, and create to share methods more than only thoughts. I think there might be a shift there also. And this, I'm also curious from the political level, because this also makes it very hard maybe to understand the outcome of these kind of processes. because what are how does this transform the political role? Because I guess you will also have another kind of purpose then, because you might not only show the report, we've been using this and this amount of money for this and that area, but we're building trust. We've created a space for people to co-create their own solutions. And so I don't know, Eve, what are your thoughts about the new kind of political role in this area of rethinking public management?
It's and I think it does, to be honest, I think it is replicated in other areas of public service, to be honest, and leadership as a whole, but it's that working with uncertainty, isn't it, really? And I don't think anyone could say anymore that we're working in certain times and we're not working in a landscape that you have to accept is continuing to move at pace and accelerate and is challenging. And in that you find your anchors, and I think the anchors are your values and your shared values, and you have to hold on to your shared purpose all the tighter. And I think that's when that's what we need then as leaders. And in the political landscape, I think that maybe is particularly challenging because we haven't adopted what I think across a lot of organisations, across the public sector, people have talked about being values led and have talked about, spending time finding common ground and purpose. And I think in the political landscape, because of political cycles, it is often very reactive, and it hasn't really been conducive for those key values and behaviours. And I think you see the difference, don't you? We've seen it during COVID with different leaders across the world and the tone they took, and whether they were divisive in their behaviours and in their language, or whether they really adopted that shared us. When people pointed to Jacinda Ardern as an example, where her language is always repeating that message of it's about us, it's about all of us. This matters to all of us, whether it's our health, whether it's our planet as our life support system, whether it's people being warm this winter. This matters to all of us. Our economy, our environment matters to all of us, and we all have a role to play in that. And being able to constantly pose that invitation to how you get involved. So to your point, I think for politicians, that's particularly hard because politicians have generally been raised on this idea that you're there to represent others, you're there to fix, you're there to do for or do to, and you have to recognise that isn't then the role. That is a far more facilitative. It is around recognising we cannot fix, we cannot speak for. We have to find ways of convening and supporting and growing that power, which makes people feel sometimes redundant, and they don't necessarily feel they have those skills or power. And I think it's supporting. It's in that kind of the dying of an old world to the rising of a new. It's how we support people to recognise their value in that space and give them the tools really that they need.
And part of that, and I'd be interested, Christa, about the Copenhagen experience, a big part of that I'm kind of hearing you and Donna talk about is that idea that it doesn't have to be the case that all services are provided by the public institution, the municipality, that actually there's a role for not-for-profit organisations. And I wonder whether, and it seems to me, complete my train of thought, that the P's that you were talking about, Eve, the people, participation, place, and power, I can see how once you start thinking like that, it leads you to that place, that actually what we're looking for is what's needed, not necessarily who's providing it. Because if something is being provided in a way that's not needed, then we have to change that. And I wonder whether that's another part of that kind of disruption that you touched on, Donna, the challenging bit, the bit where you're asking people to change. It's not just their practice, is it? It's about the world as they understand it. And I don't know in Copenhagen where some of the professionals you're working with, Christa, whether what they would make of this conversation, whether they're, okay, not for profits, that's okay, or whether they feel that it's the the municipality or the public services that exist at the moment should be the providers of services, because it's that view would have been argued, wouldn't it, some time ago as anti-local or anti the sort of the notion of a welfare state. But it does seem to me in the last 20 or 30 years, many people have moved from that position, that actually it's much more opening up and more empowering of those who need the services than it is of the people who provide them. That's a bit of a long observation. So 2 questions, I suppose. One, is that the Copenhagen experience yet? And 2, would I be right for you, Eve, and you, Donna, that remains, or have we moved on, remains a really quite big challenge to making the change. So for politicians, the role you were describing, Eve, I instinctively have sympathy for that. But I've met politicians who judge their effectiveness on the organizations that they have a leadership role in, that they are the providers of services, less facilitators, but directors in the sense of you do this. What's the Copenhagen situation, would you say, Christa? You need to unmute. You need to unmute yourself. Sorry, Christa.
Try to, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think in Copenhagen and in Denmark, we have had a much more strong welfare state, I think, than in the UK. So I think we are a little bit behind maybe you in opening up our institutions, because we have had more money into the municipalities, but now we need to create new kind of solutions. So I think many municipalities are trying to create these kind of partnership with NGOs and rethinking relationships and building up communities. But at the same time, I've just seen the last couple of months that they're also reducing the cost for exactly that area. So it's kind of parallel. They want to do it, but also they are reducing it economically. And I think some of the managers that I'm working with, which are very keen on creating relationship with communities and NGOs and citizens, they find it hard to communicate the kind of value that they're creating to the political level, because they're creating value in different kind of ways that makes it difficult to show success, because sometimes it's only like micro relations that are kind of changing the life path of a citizens, or creating new kind of networks or sustainable circles in the local area. So I think they would ask how to translate this kind of work to the political level. And that might be a question to you, Donna. How have you been working with that? If you're not as lucky to have a person like Eve, how can you then communicate this kind of work and make it to work in this way?
I think we need to have Eve running the country and the government, and that would be fantastic, as well as all the councils in it. She's shaking her head. But no, I mean, I think I'm just being honest, and I can say these things now. I'm no longer a public servant, but we've got the worst government in generations, haven't we, who are just going from one knee-jerk reaction to another knee-jerk reaction, taking money out of people's pockets and public services and getting people to pay more council tax to fund services and blaming everyone else for their ineptitude. Big gambles that they've taken, huge gambles that they've taken. And, we're seeing deaths already of people because of the cold, because of no money to heat the homes, and because of no money to feed themselves. So, I would start with, and again, we've had a bit of engagement with New Local from the Conservative Party, only a couple of people in the Conservative Party who are interested in community power. But their interpretation isn't my interpretation of what community power is. And obviously David Cameron had this big society idea where basically public services would be slimmed down and the state would be slimmed down, and the voluntary sector would do it for free. And that's certainly not my vision of community power. I do think that the whole state needs a reset. You know, as Hilary argues in Radical Help, it was designed in the 1940s for a very different society, that factory model, that 1940s factory production line model, which is no longer fit for purpose. We pay a lot less tax than you do in Denmark, and I think that's an issue. I've moved up to Scotland. We pay a lot more tax up here, but we've got better services, free prescriptions, free university, you know, shorter waiting lists. And much more investment in the community infrastructure. So, you know, I can't see that happening with the Conservative government now. And I think, you know, hopefully people will see that they need a change in a couple of years' time. But in terms of the local politicians, I think there is a bigger interest now. I know Manchester have done a lot of work on community wealth building, so keeping wealth within the local area, local supply chain management, local employment and social enterprise. But they're also interested in working with Wigan, which is great. I think someone described it as a first. I went to Manchester's Labour group and did a presentation. Everyone went, I can't believe we're learning from Wigan. Because obviously Manchester's a city and Wigan's not, it's a town. But I think there is a lot more learning. We've got 70 members of New Local now who come together and learn from each other. We have these innovation exchanges, and they all come together and learn from each other about how to embed community power within their localities. Some of them are very affluent areas down south near London. Some of them are really poor areas up in the north and the Midlands. And, you know, I think we need a reset, political reset at both levels, you know, and I'm hoping, fingers crossed, for that to happen in the election. No pressure, Eve.
Just before Eve comes in, just for Christa's benefit, so the 70 members that you talked about, they're public authorities, aren't they? They're municipalities who are members of New Local, and that's not people as in 70 members, it's 70 organisations at a local level. Sorry, Eve, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with reset. I mean, in the UK, we've got the most centralised form of government, and back to, I guess, Diva Mank. You know, part of that was because I was excited by devolution, and I never believed that a word or a top-down kind of shift maybe in structures was of itself going to lead to the radical shifts we needed. But it did provide a model, a suggestion that this is about having more power at a local level. And it has brought, I would say, the Greater Manchester family together and created a shared identity and a common purpose at a footprint of a city region, which has been incredibly powerful. The level of convening and shared learning across Greater Manchester. And I know Donna laughs about Manchester and Wigan, but, you know, I see that all the time now, every day. And it gives me a huge amount of hope, because there is, across, you know, those 10 now boroughs, there is such rich learning. There's so much to learn from each other, and there's so much that, you know, can be done at Greater Manchester level, but then also it provides some of the things that could be done then that enable time and attention to be given to things that need to be done at a more local level, and then for things to be done at even more local level. And I do feel like I'm seeing greater levels at all those layers, from people organising on their street again and things that are about being, you know, good neighbours to each other, up to things that now are being reorganised, and structures and governance investment being reorganised at a city region level. And I do think that's needed, but we haven't got that replicated at the moment nationally, and that's what really needs to shift as well, so that, yeah, resources and power flow differently, and that people are represented by people that, you know, have a similar attachment to local place and an understanding of local place and context, because context is so key, really. So all of that, and I think, you know, there's examples, aren't there? There's a push, you know. So, you know, the paper last week from, you know, Gordon Brown, Andy Burnham certainly is our mayor in Greater Manchester. You know, they're all talking about a rewiring of our democracy. And I do feel like that's going high up the agenda, but we need that in practice. And, you know, as Anna said, our current Conservative government aren't really going to be the ones that do that. But it also needs to be more than that. It needs to be owned by people And it needs to have that invitation to say, this isn't something that's just then going to be done to you. You know, what do you want this to look like? And you shape it and you take it and you use it in a way that's going to work for you in your communities, really.
I mean, just very quickly, I'm conscious of time, but just to kind of put some of that in context for you, Christa. So there's a big discussion going on, but not being led by the government, but being led by political parties about whether or not the institutions of the state, the political institutions, parliament, what exists at a regional level or local level, are fit for purpose, and there's a need to change them. And that devolution discussion is part of that, but also that's raising questions about how our democracy functions. And in parallel to that, there's this other discussion, which both Eve and Donna have referred to this afternoon, which is that idea of resetting the state, which is, and maybe that should be our next conversation, because it kind of asks, I think, a much more fundamental question about not just here in the UK, the post-war settlement after 1945, but really asks a more profound question, I think, about what role does the state have in the provision of public services, as well as how they're funded, but also the place of not-for-profit organisations and voluntary organisations. And that can be seen, can't it, as that could be a position taken by the political right who want to reduce the notion of the public, or it can be seen by those who want to open up both the political conversation, but also how services are provided. And sometimes public institutions, I would argue, are not the best providers of services. Sometimes it is not-for-profit organisations or voluntary organisations, because of perhaps their ways of working, what's led them to work perhaps less concerned about professional identities and the silos. So there's quite a big discussion. What's fascinating to me is some of it is just being is being put on one side. So I think the present government wouldn't recognise the case that Eve just made for devolution and changes. And they would probably say, Donna, we can reduce your taxes if you weren't living in Scotland. That's the problem of living in Scotland. So they don't hear that bit of it, which is actually because some of the services are better. So it's not that funding is irrelevant, but it's a really interesting question about who provides, it seems to me, is part of this discussion.
Absolutely. And I think that, sorry to jump in, but I think the current government don't work for people. And I think they realise that they've now got, 2 years left, and they work for businesses and for profiteers and for extractive capitalism. And they've made that so clear, haven't they, with the mini budget, where it's decimated the economy. But some people were made incredibly wealthy. And so, yeah, sorry to be cynical, but
no. Well, I mean,
I don't think they work for people.
No.
So maybe that is also why it's so important to have these examples from smaller villages that gives some kind of hope that we can work in more regenerative ways, and maybe it's even more radical than asking what is needed at this place. Maybe it's also a question about how we intensify and multiply life, not only for humans, but also for the people that are living there. And maybe that would also change the way we talk about public management or public services, because maybe public services are not the right word anymore, because it gives this transaction idea. So maybe it is more like relations, but also activities that we're creating. But I think, so what is interesting is that we begin to think about the place as a scene for public management and begin to map all the resources and qualities we have at that place, to begin to kind of gather all these bricks and qualities to create something together. And I'm curious about how could we kind of elaborate on how this not only creates value for the poor people or for the ones who's dying, but also for the place and for all the other ecosystems at that place, so we can maybe fold out that this is a way of working that has many benefits and not only for this target group that we're working with. And I'm thinking in that term, you said the name of Kate Warworth, maybe. We need also to think about economic in a more collaborative way to begin to show the value of this kind of work that you both are doing. I don't know if that's something you have any experiences with to use this kind of vocabulary of collaborative economy or donut economy. And I know the time is short, so maybe it's only a short reflection on that.
Yeah. I could completely agree, and yeah, lots of examples, both again at a local level within the particular neighbourhood that I'm a councillor in Chorlton of taking a far more kind of place-based approach to how we convene and commune people and recognise what we have in common and how we work together. And in that, to the point around the role of the state, I think it's because I believe public services, the state have a very important role, and I think local government has a very important leadership role to play and does need the resources in order to be able to play that role to its best ability. I think the difference is it's about collective leadership, and I think it's how, for so much of this, they need to be one of, you know, the leaders in a space that can work in a collective way and enable that far more distributive and regenerative ways of working and of mobilising. And I think that's replicated then again, you know, at a city region level and national level. So it's not that they need to step back as in their leadership or in their own resources, quite the opposite. We need, you know, there are things that I believe in. We've done it, you know, in higher taxes in the UK, and investing in our public transport is critical for people and places and the planet to thrive. And that does need, you know, us to be able to do that at a national and a city region and a local way, which is going to work for people and the journeys that they make. You know, we need our health and care system to work well, and that doesn't mean it needs to be the state alone. I think social enterprises and others have a role to play in that, but there is a leadership and there's a glue and there's a collective role that we then have to facilitate in all of that. So yes, I'm finding that people are increasingly understanding, and I know you've been seeing it for a long time, Donna, you know, what it means to work together in a place. And from a GM Moving perspective, you know, we're now seeing organisations that, you know, have been national organisations that have been very used to be honest, dropping in kind of projects or programmes that drop in and drop out, and they can do, at worst, they can do harm to people actually, rather than improving things, and they often cause duplication, they create gaps, but they give them something they can point towards as we've delivered this. They don't necessarily deliver and support for the best outcomes of local people, and we are seeing a massive shift to people being prepared to pool their budgets, to work collectively, to recognise that they can't necessarily attribute what they're funding to this one thing and cut a ribbon, but they can collectively see that what they're doing is more likely to have the impact it needs. But it takes time, it takes trust, you have to build relationships, and you need conditions that mean they're not pitted against each other in a frenzy for crumbs on the table, unfortunately. But yeah, some good examples.
Did you want to add anything, Don? I'm conscious that, because I think
no,
that's a really
I think
good
Eve
summary.
said it all. Eve summed it up beautifully.
So Donna, what would your good advice for public managers in Denmark be if they want to begin to create new pathways for sharing and building up relations? And
I think it's the Nike slogan, isn't it? Just do it. I think there's too much talk and not enough action. And I think we need to move to action. I think frontline public servants need to be empowered to do the right thing by citizens. And I think very often they're rules bound by, you can't do that, as you said at the beginning. You know, you can't, this is a deficit model. tick box eligibility criteria, management gatekeeping role, and that's not what they signed up for. Most public servants want to serve the public and help people. So I think they need leaders who are courageous, bold, fearless, who are going to try new things and empower their teams, have their back, and get them to encourage them to try new things. As long as no one dies, it's okay, just try it. I think that what we are guaranteed to do and to fail on is not trying to change things and trying to manage status quo. We've seen these new integrated care systems, 42 of them, come into England, and some of them are just doing management of the existing system. So people come in on huge salaries, ginormous salaries, but are just managing what already exists as another layer and shouting at people in a different way. There's more of them to shout at the people on the front line now. So, that is not leadership for me. I think we need a completely different type of leader.
John, don't you think that will be the good way to end this conversation?
Great way to end it. Yes, a new type of leader, which kind of brings together both what you were saying, Eve, at the end, and you, Donna.
I've got so into this conversation, my glasses have steamed up.
Yeah, and I'm getting more and more warm here, I can see. Yeah. We need to get to action. This is very...
We do.
You should take that as an indicator of success, have your glasses steamed up in this conversation.
That could be a new KPI. Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Far more meaningful than many of them, to be fair.
So thanks so much for joining us. We really, really appreciated it. And that's from my point of view, I don't know about what Christa can say it herself, but that's been incredibly helpful and really interesting. And thank you.